"Say that again," the old man said quietly, his voice so calm it barely seemed to belong in the room, and yet it carried farther than the judge's gavel ever could. The courtroom had been filled with the usual low murmur of a Tuesday morning docket, the soft shuffle of papers, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the stale scent of polished wood and old carpet hanging in the air like something that had settled there decades ago and never left. But that single word, coward, had cut through everything like a clean line drawn across still water, leaving a silence behind it that felt heavier than the walls themselves. And at the center of it sat Thomas Hale, 79 years old, shoulders slightly hunched, hands resting calmly on the worn arms of a wooden chair that creaked softly whenever he shifted his weight. His suit simple, dark, pressed but old, the kind of suit a man wears because it's the only one he owns, not because he's trying to impress anyone. And yet there was something about the way he sat there, unmoving, unbothered, that made the silence feel intentional, as if it belonged to him more than to anyone else in the room. While up on the bench, Judge Richard Cole leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his expression tight with the kind of confidence that came from years of being the final word in every room he entered, his voice still echoing faintly in the air as if even the walls had taken note of it. And around them the courtroom watched, a mix of clerks, attorneys, a few curious civilians waiting for their own cases to be called, all of them caught in that strange pause where no one quite knew if they were supposed to speak or stay silent. And yet no one moved, because something about the old man made movement feel unnecessary, as if the moment itself hadn't finished unfolding yet. And the judge, sensing that hesitation, shifted slightly, his chair letting out a quiet groan as he leaned back just enough to reclaim control of the room. "I said," he continued, his tone sharpening, "that refusing to answer a direct question about your service, especially in a federal courtroom, doesn't make you honorable, Mr. Hale. It makes you evasive, and where I sit, that looks a lot like cowardice," the word landing again softer, this time, but no less deliberate. And still Thomas Hale didn't react, not in the way the room expected. No anger, no defense, no raised voice, just a slow breath, almost unnoticeable, the kind of breath a man takes when he's heard worse and survived it, his eyes drifting for a brief second, not to the judge, but past him, somewhere beyond the bench, as if the room itself was only a temporary place he happened to be sitting in. And that was when Daniel Brooks, standing near the prosecution table, with a file tucked under his arm, felt it, that small, creeping sense that something was off, not wrong in the obvious way, but off in a way that made the back of his neck tighten, because he had seen veterans before, had worked cases with them, had heard their stories, and there was a certain stillness that came with men who had lived through things that didn't make it into reports, a kind of quiet that wasn't weakness but control. And Thomas Hale had that quiet in a way that didn't match the word that had just been used against him. And yet the judge pressed on, tapping a pen lightly against the bench, the faint click echoing in the silence. "You've been given multiple opportunities to clarify your record," he said, "and instead you sit there and say nothing. So I'll ask you plainly one more time. What unit did you serve in?" And this time the question hung there, sharper, more pointed, as if the entire room leaned forward just a fraction, waiting, and for a moment nothing happened. Just the low hum of the lights, the distant sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall, the faint scrape of a chair as someone shifted in the gallery. And then Thomas Hale moved. Not much, just enough to lift his head a fraction, his eyes finally settling on the judge, clear, steady, and far older than the number written on any document in front of them. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, it wasn't anything like the voice that had called him a coward. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of voice a man uses when he knows he doesn't need to raise it to be heard. And yet every single person in that room heard it, every single one of them felt it, even before they understood it, as he said, simply, "You're asking the wrong question." The words did not land the way the judge expected them to, not with defiance, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet certainty that seemed to shift the air in the room just enough for people to notice. And Judge Cole's pen stopped tapping mid-rhythm, hovering above the polished surface of the bench as his eyes narrowed slightly, recalibrating, because he had heard many responses in his courtroom over the years, excuses, denials, rehearsed statements polished by attorneys, but this was none of This was something else, something that did not try to fight the authority in front of it, and yet did not yield to it either. And that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. The wrong question, he repeated, leaning forward again, his tone now edged with irritation rather than confidence. You do not get to decide which questions matter in this courtroom. Mr. Hale, you answer what is asked, or you face the consequences of refusing to cooperate. And the word consequences lingered, just long enough to remind everyone in the room exactly who held power there. But Thomas Hale did not shift, did not glance away, did not show the smallest sign of pressure. Instead, he let a slow breath leave him, the kind of breath that seemed to measure time differently, as if seconds inside this room did not carry the same weight they did for everyone else. And when he spoke again, it was just as calm, just as steady. You are asking where I served, he said, his voice low but clear. But that is not what matters. And somewhere to the left, a chair scraped lightly as someone adjusted their posture. The sound sharp in the otherwise still room, and Daniel Brooks felt that tightening again, sharper this time, because there was something deliberate in the way the old man chose his words, not defensive, not evasive, but precise, like someone used to saying only what needed to be said and nothing more. And he found himself watching Thomas Hale more closely now, noticing details he had overlooked before. The way his hands rested loosely but not weakly, the way his shoulders, though aged, held a kind of quiet alignment, the way his eyes never darted or searched for approval, and it did not match the profile of a man trying to hide anything. And yet the judge pressed forward, his patience thinning. Then enlighten us, he said, a faint edge of sarcasm slipping through. If not where you served, what exactly do you believe matters here? And for a moment it seemed like Thomas might not answer at all, his gaze drifting again, not away in avoidance, but outward, as if he were measuring something beyond the walls, beyond the courtroom, beyond even the present moment. And when he finally spoke, it was softer still, almost reflective. Who needed me? He said, and the simplicity of it seemed to confuse more than clarify. A faint murmur rippling through the gallery as people tried to make sense of it, and Judge Cole let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough to signal dismissal. That is not how this works, he said, sharper now. You are not here to deliver philosophy. You are here to answer a direct question, and if you continue to refuse, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt. And there it was, the line drawn clearly, authority reasserted, consequences defined, the structure of the room snapping back into place like a tightened wire. But even then Thomas Hale did not react the way the room expected, did not stiffen, did not argue, did not look to his attorney. Instead he leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood giving a quiet creak beneath him, his eyes settling once more on the judge with that same steady calm. And Daniel Brooks felt something shift in his chest, a quiet realization forming without fully taking shape yet. Because men who were afraid did not look like that. They did not sit like that. They did not speak like that. And whatever was happening here, it was no longer about a simple refusal to answer. It was something deeper, something the courtroom was not prepared to recognize. And for the first time since the exchange began, the silence that followed did not belong to the judge. It did not belong to the court. It belonged entirely to the man sitting quietly in the chair, and everyone in the room felt it, even if they could not explain why. The judge let the silence stretch just long enough to remind everyone that he could, his fingers now resting flat against the bench as if anchoring himself back into the authority he was accustomed to. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, not louder, but more controlled, the kind of control that comes when a man decides he will not lose command of a room no matter what is unfolding in front of him. Mr. Hale, he said slowly, each word measured. This is not a philosophical debate, and it is certainly not a stage for whatever narrative you believe you are entitled to present. You are here because you refuse to comply with a federal inquiry, and right now you are doing it again in open court. And a few heads in the gallery nodded almost instinctively, drawn back into the familiar structure of authority and procedure, because that was easier to understand than whatever quiet tension had been building. But Daniel Brooks did not nod. He did not move at all, his attention locked onto Thomas Hale in a way that felt increasingly difficult to explain even to himself, because there was something in the old man's stillness that did not align with the situation, something that suggested not defiance, not confusion, but awareness, as if he understood exactly where this moment would lead long before anyone else in the room had even realized there was somewhere to go. And that thought settled uneasily in Daniel's mind as the judge continued. You have been asked a direct question regarding your service record, and you have chosen to answer with ambiguity and silence, both of which are unacceptable in this courtroom. So I will ask you one final time, and I advise you to consider your response carefully. And the words hung there, deliberate, final, the kind of line that usually marked the end of hesitation and the beginning of consequence. And somewhere near the back a man cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable in the otherwise still room, and Thomas Hale did not rush to fill the silence that followed. He did not react to the warning in the judge's tone. Instead, he lowered his gaze for just a moment, not in submission, but in thought, as if he were choosing something, not words exactly, but timing. And when he lifted his head again, there was no change in his expression. No tension, no urgency, only that same steady calm that had unsettled the room from the beginning. And when he spoke, it was almost quiet enough to be missed. You already know what happens if I answer that question, he said, and the statement landed differently than anything he had said before, not because of its volume, but because of its implication, and Judge Cole's brow tightened slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as he leaned forward again. No, Mr. Hale, he replied, his tone firm. What happens is that you comply with a lawful request, something you seem determined to avoid. But even as he said it, there was a subtle shift in the room, something intangible but unmistakable, because the confidence in his voice did not fully settle the space the way it had earlier, and Daniel Brooks felt it clearly now. That sense that the conversation had moved beyond the judge's control without anyone explicitly acknowledging it, and he found himself glancing down at the file in his hand, flipping it open with a quiet motion, scanning lines he had already read earlier that morning, searching for something he had missed, something that might explain the disconnect between the man in front of him and the narrative being applied to him. And there it was again, that absence, that strange lack of detail where there should have been clarity, sections marked, redacted, references that led nowhere, and a faint unease crept further into his chest as he looked back up at Thomas Hale, who had not moved, who had not shifted, who simply sat there as if the weight of the room did not belong to him at all. And for the first time, Daniel began to consider a possibility he had not allowed himself to think before, that the silence was not avoidance, that it was not refusal, but protection, not of himself, but of something else, something larger than the courtroom, larger than the case. And that thought settled into place just as Thomas Hale drew a slow breath and spoke. Again, his voice no louder than before, but carrying with it a quiet finality that made the air feel thinner. Some things are not written down for a reason, he said, and this time the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was expectant, as if the room itself understood, even if the people inside it did not, that whatever came next would not belong to the judge anymore. Judge Cole's expression hardened, not dramatically, but in that subtle, tightening way that comes when a man realizes control is beginning to slip and refuses to acknowledge it, his jaw setting just slightly as his fingers pressed flat against the bench, grounding himself in the one thing that had always worked before: authority, structure, the expectation that when he spoke, the room followed. That is not for you to decide, he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate, each word placed carefully as if precision alone could restore order. This court does not operate on personal discretion or selective silence. It operates on law, and the law requires transparency, not riddles. And a few people in the gallery shifted again, drawn back into the familiar rhythm of procedure, because the judge's voice still carried weight, still carried expectation, but it did not carry certainty the way it had at the start. And that difference, small as it was, settled into the room like a draft no one could quite locate, while Thomas Hale remained exactly as he had been, unmoved, his hands resting loosely, his shoulders steady, his eyes clear, and there was no defiance in him, no challenge, just that same quiet presence that seemed to absorb the tension instead of reacting to it. And Daniel Brooks felt it more clearly now than ever. That growing sense that the entire exchange had shifted into something none of them had prepared for, something that did not fit neatly into procedure or precedent. And without realizing it, he found himself stepping slightly back from the table, creating space as if instinctively distancing himself from whatever line was being approached, and the judge noticed, just for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicking toward Daniel before returning to Thomas. And that flicker, that momentary break in focus, said more than any raised voice could have, because it revealed doubt, small but undeniable, and Judge Cole corrected it quickly, straightening, reclaiming posture. "You will answer the question," he said, firmer now, leaning forward just enough to press the weight of his position into the words, "or I will hold you in contempt of court and have you removed from this room." And there it was again, the structure, the consequence, the finality that had ended countless arguments before, and for a moment it seemed like the room might settle back into place, like the tension might resolve into something familiar, something predictable. But Thomas Hale did not respond immediately. He did not react to the threat. Instead, he let the silence stretch again, not long, not dramatic, just enough to make it clear that his response was not dictated by the judge's timeline. And when he finally moved, it was minimal, a slight shift of his right hand, the fabric of his sleeve pulling back just enough to reveal the edge of a faded mark on his wrist, not quite a scar, not quite a symbol, something older than either. And it caught Daniel's attention instantly, not because he recognized it, but because of the way Thomas seemed completely unaware of revealing it, as if it held no significance to him anymore. And yet something about it felt deliberate, connected to the silence, connected to everything that was not being said, and Daniel's breath slowed. Without him realizing it, his focus narrowing, the room around him fading slightly as his attention locked onto that small detail, because in cases like this, in moments like this, it was always the smallest detail that mattered, the thing everyone else overlooked, and he felt it then, that quiet shift from uncertainty into recognition, not full understanding, not yet, but the unmistakable sense that there was something here, something buried beneath the absence in the records, something that explained the calm, the restraint, the refusal to answer in a way that was not refusal at all. And before he could fully process it, Thomas Hale spoke again, his voice steady, unchanged, but carrying a weight that did not come from volume. "If I answer the way you want," he said, his eyes meeting the judge's without hesitation, "you will not be the one deciding what happens next." And the statement landed in the room like a quiet fracture, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to make everything feel slightly off balance. And for the first time since the exchange began, Judge Cole did not respond immediately, his lips parting as if to speak, then stopping, the smallest hesitation, barely noticeable. But there, and in that fraction of a second, the room shifted again, because authority had paused, and silence, once again, belonged entirely to the man sitting in the chair. The hesitation did not last long, but it lasted long enough. And in a courtroom built on precision and control, even a fraction of a second could feel like something breaking loose beneath the surface. And Judge Cole felt it, even if he refused to acknowledge it, his posture tightening as he leaned forward again, reclaiming his position with a deliberate inhale. "You are not in a position to make implications," he said, his voice firm, measured, but no longer carrying the same effortless dominance it had earlier. "You are here under the authority of this court, and whatever you believe may happen outside of it is irrelevant to what happens inside it." And the words were clean, structured, practiced, the kind of words that had ended countless disputes before, but they did not land the same way this time, because the room had already shifted, something subtle but irreversible, and Daniel Brooks felt it most clearly. His attention no longer divided between procedure and observation, now fully locked onto Thomas Hale, his mind replaying every detail, every pause, every word that had been said, and more importantly, everything that had not been said. And it was in that absence that the pattern began to form, incomplete but undeniable, because records that were missing did not usually come with this kind of composure, and silence that was empty did not carry weight like this. And without fully deciding to do it, Daniel took a step back from the table, his hand slipping into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing against his phone, the motion small enough to go unnoticed by most of the room, but not by Thomas Hale, whose eyes shifted just slightly, not turning his head, not breaking posture, just enough to acknowledge that he had seen it. And that subtle awareness sent a quiet jolt through Daniel, because it confirmed something he had not yet put into words, that the man sitting in that chair was not reacting to the room. He was reading it, anticipating it, and that realization settled heavily as Daniel moved another step toward the side aisle, creating just enough distance to make a call without drawing attention. While at the bench, Judge Cole continued, pressing forward as if momentum alone could restore order. "This is your final opportunity," he said, his tone sharpening again. "State your unit, your rank, and your service, or I will proceed accordingly." And the finality in his voice echoed faintly against the walls, but it did not fill the space the way it should have. Not anymore, because Thomas Hale did not rush to answer, did not react to the ultimatum. Instead, he let a slow breath leave him, his gaze lowering for a moment, not in submission, but in reflection, and then, almost absent-mindedly, his thumb brushed against the inside of his wrist, right where that faint, faded mark rested, and the moment his skin made contact with it, something shifted, not in the room, but in him, a memory surfacing not as images, but as sensation, the weight of silence in places where silence was the only thing that kept people alive, the understanding that words, once spoken, could not be taken back, could not be contained, and when he lifted his head again, there was no change in his expression, but there was a decision behind his eyes now, quiet, final. And across the room, Daniel had already turned slightly away, his phone now in his hand. The screen dimmed against his palm as he dialed a number he had not used in years, his thumb hesitating for just a fraction of a second before pressing it to his ear. And as the line began to ring, faint and distant beneath the tension of the courtroom, Thomas Hale finally spoke, his voice low, almost too soft to register at first, but clear enough that every ear in the room caught it, as if the silence itself carried the sound. "You keep asking for a unit," he said, his eyes steady on the judge, "but there is no unit you would recognize." And the words did not sound like defiance. They did not sound like avoidance. They sounded like fact, and that difference settled into the room like a weight no one could quite explain. And Judge Cole opened his mouth to respond, to reassert control, to pull the moment back into something familiar. But before he could speak, the faintest sound slipped into the edge of the silence. The quiet click of a call connecting. Somewhere in the room, unnoticed by most, but not by Thomas Hale, whose gaze shifted just slightly, not toward Daniel, but toward the sound itself, as if he had been expecting it all along. The voice on the other end of the line answered on the second ring, crisp, controlled, the kind of voice that did not belong to casual conversations, and Daniel Brooks turned slightly farther away from the courtroom, lowering his head just enough to shield the call without drawing attention. "Colonel Hayes," he said under his breath, careful, measured. "This is Daniel Brooks. I am in federal court, and I need you to verify something immediately." And there was a pause on the other end, not long, but deliberate, as if the name alone had triggered a recognition that required no introduction. "Go ahead," the voice replied, and Daniel glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes landing on Thomas Hale, who had not moved, who had not shifted, who sat exactly as before, as if time in the room had no bearing on him at all. And Daniel felt that tightening again, sharper now, more focused. "The name is Thomas Hale," he continued quietly. 79, no clear service record, multiple redactions, and he hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, because the next part felt different, less like a detail and more like a key. And he just said, "There is no unit we would recognize." And the silence on the other end stretched slightly longer this time. Not confusion, not dismissal, something else, something closer to recalculation. And then the voice came back, lower now, more precise, "Spell the name." And Daniel did, each letter steady, deliberate. And as he spoke, the courtroom behind him continued in that suspended state. Judge Cole still poised to respond. The gallery still caught between curiosity and restraint, and Thomas Hale still unmoving, his gaze resting somewhere just beyond the bench as if he were listening to something none of them could hear. And when Daniel finished spelling the name, there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by the faintest shift in tone on the other end of the line, subtle but unmistakable. "Stay where you are," Colonel Hayes said, and the words were not a suggestion, not advice. They were instruction, clean and immediate. "Do not escalate anything. Do not press him further, and do not let anyone remove him from that courtroom. And Daniel's breath caught slightly, not visibly, but enough for him to feel it, because that was not the response he had expected, not verification, not dismissal, but containment, and before he could ask anything further, the line went quiet, the call ending as abruptly as it had begun, and Daniel lowered the phone slowly, his hand steady but his mind racing now, the pieces shifting into place faster than he could fully process them, because responses like that did not happen for ordinary cases. They did not happen for incomplete records or uncooperative witnesses. They happened when something far larger was involved, something that operated beyond the boundaries of the courtroom, and as he turned back toward the front of the room, the weight of that realization settled into his posture, subtle but undeniable, and at the bench Judge Cole had regained his rhythm, his voice cutting back into the silence with renewed firmness. "This is your final warning," he said, leaning forward again, his eyes fixed on Thomas Hale. "You will answer the question, or I will have you removed from this courtroom immediately." And the words landed with authority, with expectation, but not with certainty. Not anymore. And Thomas Hale looked at him, really looked at him this time, not past him, not beyond him, but directly at him. And there was no anger in his eyes, no challenge, just a quiet understanding. The kind that comes from seeing a situation clearly long before anyone else realizes what it is. And when he spoke, his voice was even softer than before, almost a whisper, but the room carried it, every corner of it, as if the silence itself made space for the words. "You still think this is about me," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not dismissive, not superior, just certain, and Daniel felt it again, that shift, that unmistakable sense that the center of control had moved without anyone formally acknowledging it. And somewhere deep in the building, far from the courtroom, something had already begun to respond. For a moment, no one moved, not because they were told to stay still, but because something deeper than instruction had settled over the room, a quiet, invisible pressure that made even the smallest motion feel out of place. And Judge Cole felt it as clearly as anyone, though he fought it with the only tool he had ever relied on, authority, his hand lifting slightly as if to call the room back into order. "This proceeding will not be derailed by vague statements and implied threats," he said, his voice firm, measured, but carrying a faint strain now, the kind that crept in when control was no longer absolute. "Bailiff," he added, without looking away from Thomas Hale, "prepare to remove the defendant if he refuses to comply." And the bailiff, a broad-shouldered man who had spent years enforcing the quiet boundaries of the courtroom, shifted his stance, one foot moving forward with practiced readiness. But even he hesitated, just slightly, because something about the stillness in front of him did not match the situations he was used to handling. And that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, not by Daniel Brooks, not by the few observers in the gallery who had begun to sense that this moment did not follow the rules they understood, and certainly not by Thomas Hale, who watched it all with the same calm awareness, his eyes moving not quickly, not sharply, but deliberately, taking in each detail as if confirming something he had already anticipated. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his posture, he spoke again. "You can stop him," he said quietly, not to the bailiff, not even directly to the judge, but into the space between them, as if the words were meant for the moment itself, and they landed there, soft but undeniable, and for a fraction of a second, the bailiff did stop, his forward motion pausing mid-step as if the instruction had come from somewhere higher than the bench, and Judge Cole's expression tightened, irritation flashing more openly now. "That is not your decision to make," he snapped, his voice sharper, the control in it now forced rather than natural. "This court." But the sentence did not finish, not because he chose to stop, but because something interrupted it, not loudly, not dramatically, just a sound that did not belong to the rhythm of the room. The distant but unmistakable echo of heavy doors opening somewhere down the hallway outside, followed by the faint, synchronized cadence of footsteps, measured, controlled, not hurried, not chaotic, but purposeful in a way that drew attention without demanding it. And the courtroom felt it before it understood it, the subtle shift in air, the way the silence seemed to deepen rather than break. And Daniel Brooks turned his head slightly toward the door, his pulse steady but his awareness heightened. Because he recognized that rhythm, not from personal experience, but from stories, from briefings, from the rare moments when something outside normal jurisdiction stepped into a space that was not designed to contain it. And the bailiff, still half a step forward, glanced toward the entrance as well, uncertainty flickering across his face for the first time, while Judge Cole remained facing forward, his jaw set, his posture rigid, determined not to acknowledge what he could not yet see. And through it all, Thomas Hale did not turn, did not look toward the door, did not react to the approaching presence at all, as if it had nothing to do with him, or perhaps as if it had everything to do with him, and therefore required no attention. His gaze remaining steady, his breathing even, his presence unchanged, and in that contrast, between the growing awareness in the room and the absolute stillness of the man at its center, something became unmistakably clear. The moment had already shifted, the outcome already set in motion, and whatever was about to enter that courtroom was not arriving to change it, but to confirm it. The sound reached the courtroom before the people did, a measured, deliberate cadence that did not rush and did not hesitate, each step evenly spaced as if guided by something more precise than urgency. And when the doors finally opened, they did not slam or creak or draw attention in any dramatic way. They simply moved, quietly, smoothly, and yet every head in the room turned at once as if pulled by the same unseen thread. Because what entered was not chaos, not disruption, but presence. The kind that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and at the front of it walked a man in uniform, not ornate, not decorated in a way meant to impress, but unmistakably carrying authority in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes moved across the room, not searching but assessing. And behind him 2 others followed at a respectful distance, their posture aligned, their movement synchronized without effort. And the shift in the courtroom was immediate, not loud, not spoken, but absolute. Conversations that had not yet started stopped before they could begin, breath slowed, shoulders straightened, and even the faint hum of the lights seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. And Judge Cole, who had not turned at first, finally did, his expression tightening as he took in the figures now standing just inside the doorway. And for the first time since the proceedings began, uncertainty crossed his face without restraint, because this was not part of the structure he controlled. This was not something he had prepared for or authorized, and the man in uniform did not ask for permission to approach, did not wait for acknowledgement. He simply walked forward, his steps steady, his gaze fixed not on the judge, not on the bailiff, but on Thomas Hale. And as he reached the center of the room, he stopped, not abruptly, but with the kind of precision that comes from long habit. And for a brief moment, nothing happened, no words, no commands, just silence. And then, with a small, deliberate motion, the man brought his hand up, not hurried, not exaggerated, and offered a salute, clean, exact, held just long enough to make its meaning unmistakable. And the air in the room shifted completely, because salutes like that were not given lightly. They were not offered without reason, and they were never directed at someone who had just been called what Thomas Hale had been called minutes earlier. And Daniel Brooks felt it like a line being drawn across everything he thought he understood, his breath slowing as realization settled fully into place. Not speculation anymore, not instinct, but certainty. And around him the courtroom followed, not by instruction, not by command, but by recognition. One person straightening, then another, the quiet ripple of awareness moving through the room as people began to understand that they were witnessing something that did not belong to them, something that existed outside the boundaries of law and procedure. And Judge Cole remained seated for a fraction of a second too long, his mind catching up to what his eyes had already seen. And then, almost abruptly, he stood, not out of reflex, not out of courtesy, but because something in the moment made sitting feel impossible. And still Thomas Hale had not moved, not when the doors opened, not when the footsteps approached, not even when the salute was given, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, as if none of it surprised him, as if all of it had been expected. And when he finally lifted his eyes to meet the man in uniform, there was no acknowledgement in the traditional sense, no return salute, no gesture, just a quiet meeting of understanding between 2 people who did not need to explain themselves. And after a brief pause, the man lowered his hand, his voice calm, controlled, carrying easily through the room without effort. "Sir," he said, not to the judge, not to the court, but to Thomas Hale, "we have been looking for you." And in that single sentence, everything that had been missing, everything that had been questioned, everything that had been dismissed, shifted into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. No one spoke after that, not because they were told to remain silent, but because the moment itself had already decided it, and Judge Cole stood there behind the bench, his posture upright, his expression carefully composed. Yet there was something unmistakably different now, the sharp certainty that had defined him earlier replaced by a measured stillness, as if he were recalculating everything he thought he understood about the man in front of him, while the uniformed officer took one step closer, not invading, not asserting, but bridging a distance that no longer felt physical, and his voice, when he spoke again, remained controlled, respectful, but carried a quiet gravity that filled the room without effort. "We received confirmation less than 10 minutes ago," he said, his eyes still on Thomas Hale. "Clearance protocols were triggered the moment your name was verified." And the words moved through the courtroom like a current, subtle but undeniable, and Daniel Brooks felt it fully now, the last pieces falling into place, the call, the response, the instruction to hold, all of it aligning with what stood before him. And he realized then that this had never been about a missing record or a refusal to cooperate. It had been about something that did not exist within ordinary systems, something that only revealed itself under very specific conditions. And Thomas Hale listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his hands still resting lightly where they had been from the beginning. And after a brief pause, he gave the smallest nod, not acknowledgement in the formal sense, but confirmation, quiet and complete. And the officer inclined his head in return before shifting his attention, just slightly, toward the bench, not challenging, not confrontational, but unmistakably clear. "Your Honor," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "This individual falls under federal protection and restricted classification. Any further questioning regarding his service is outside the jurisdiction of this court." And the statement did not raise in volume, did not carry force in the traditional sense, but it did not need to, because its authority was inherent, and Judge Cole felt it as surely as anyone in the room, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench as he absorbed the words, the implications, the sudden and complete shift in control. And for a moment, just a moment, he said nothing, the silence stretching not in tension now, but in recognition. And when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, composed, but stripped of the earlier edge. "If that is the case," he said slowly, "then this court will require official documentation to support that claim." And it was not defiance, not resistance, but adherence to the structure he knew, the only structure he had left to stand on. And the officer nodded once, a small, precise motion. "It is already being transmitted," he replied, and almost as if on cue, a quiet chime echoed from the clerk's desk, the soft glow of a screen shifting as a secured file appeared, its header marked with identifiers that did not invite questions. And the clerk hesitated, her eyes widening slightly as she read, before looking up at the judge, and that look said everything, because it carried no confusion, no doubt, only confirmation. And Judge Cole exhaled slowly, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough for himself, and he gave a single nod, the kind that closed a matter without needing further words. "The court acknowledges the classification," he said, his voice steady, final. And with that, the structure of the room shifted one last time, not back to what it had been, but into something quieter, more aware. And through it all, Thomas Hale remained seated, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had simply unfolded the way it was always meant to. And as the officer stepped back, allowing the space to settle, Daniel Brooks found himself looking at the old man one last time, not with curiosity now, not even with surprise, but with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken, because some things, he understood now, were never meant to be explained, only recognized. And in the stillness that followed, the lesson lingered without announcement, without emphasis, simple and undeniable, that respect is not demanded, it is revealed, often in silence, and remembered long after the room has emptied.